this time, we're going to move to further debate, and I recognize the member for Oshawa.
Thank you very much, Speaker, and I am very glad to be able to take my place in this legislature and speak as the critic for the official opposition, as the infrastructure, transportation and highways critic. It falls to me to bring hopefully thoughtful comments on Bill 151, which is, the short title is Improving Real Estate Management Act 2023. So what is this bill? It's not a big bill. It accomplishes a couple of clear pieces, which I'll outline, but basically this bill continues the government's centralization of their real estate holdings. The government says modernizing. I get a little twitchy. This bill seems to solve a problem, though, that we can't identify and the government hasn't thoroughly explained. The 2017 Auditor General's report was scathing, and it outlined numerous recommendations for this government to clean up their act and improve real estate management. Instead of addressing that series of recommendations, we got Bill 69 and now Bill 151, which really are tinkering around the edges. Instead of public civil servants who are accountable looking after things, the government is putting even more under the Infrastructure Ontario umbrella, where they rely on expensive private contractors to be in charge. Speaker, the private contractors show up a lot in the Auditor General's report, and in that report, there's nothing good that they have to say. The public does not trust this government's decisions, and frankly, we don't either. And I would like for this minister and the government to prove that they aren't doing something harmful. So, on the face of it, it's just a couple of changes. It will have an impact on 11 entities this particular phase or in this bill. As I said, they had already started with Bill 69. And I guess sort of the point of all this remains to be seen. So we will look forward to hearing back from the entities affected and find out what that actually means for them. Because, Speaker, there is no evidence that further centralization of real estate management will make things better in Ontario. There is some evidence that centralization may make things more challenging or make things worse, and there is no reason to trust the government's intentions. So I hope that during this debate, as I raise some questions, that the government can address those over the course of debate. So, Speaker, this Bill 151, the Improving Real Estate Management Act 2023, is the second phase of centralization of the province's real estate holdings under Infrastructure Ontario. As I said, Bill 69 started, and this Bill 151 continues. We don't know what problem this bill is meant to solve. It certainly doesn't solve the problems revealed in the Auditor General report, may make things worse. But in short, this bill does nothing to address the actual problems cited by the Auditor General with respect to the Ministry of Infrastructure's poor oversight of real estate services in Ontario. We had a ministry briefing the other morning, which I appreciate. I really appreciate the briefings, and not as a thank you to the government, but a thank you to the folks who do the heavy lifting in the ministries. Because there are a lot of staff that make this place run, but there are a lot of, we say bureaucrats, sometimes affectionately, sometimes not, but that know what they're doing and do a lot of work, sometimes at the whim and the behest of the minister, but hopefully in the best interests of Ontarians. And I appreciated the briefing that they gave us, but I will say that a lot of the language did not really put my mind at ease and did not help clarify, because it was a lot of modernization language, optimization, and I don't know what that means in practical terms. So we don't, as I said, I don't trust the government when they say modernization, because it always does mean privatization. What I'm going to do is explain from their own briefing notes. There are 11 entities, okay, ranging from Ontario Health or the Niagara Escarpment Commission or Algonquin Forestry Committee to Science North, the Royal Ontario Museum, McMichael Canadian Art Collection, quite a range. And they have broken them into two chunks, those that will be fully centralized, their real estate holdings, and those that will have a tailored approach. And my layperson's understanding of that is those with a more complex service delivery, like the Metropolitan Toronto Convention Centre Corporation, or Science North, or the McMichael, that they are part of the tailored approach where anything to do with buying or selling of freehold real property, that has to go through Cabinet, the Lieutenant Governor in Council, that's Cabinet, or the Minister of that entity's oversight ministry. Okay, so that's that group. That's the tailored approach. But the other ones, so Ontario Agency for Health Protection and Promotion, so Public Health Ontario, Ontario Health, the Ontario Science Centre, the Niagara Escarpment Commission, the proposed Ontario Health at Home that we're talking about in Bill 135, all of those will be fully centralized. So this would create a framework to remove or modify each of those entities' ability to deal with real property. So it basically provides the Minister of Infrastructure control of their real estate, control of their property that was up to this point under the control of that entity. Okay, so it's kind of snaking all their property, bringing it under Infrastructure Ontario. The other ones is to take away their opportunities to buy or sell. That's an abbreviated version. If I have said that or framed that incorrectly, I'm sure someone over there can explain it. But that's from the ministry's own briefing. And something else that they have mentioned in here is the stakeholder reaction. And this is where we're listening, and I would encourage the folks at home who are affected by this legislation to reach out and tell us how it affects them. Because, as it says in here, several entities have felt that this initiative is aligned with their ongoing initiatives. That's what it says here. But it does say others have indicated a need for further dialogue to understand the practical implications. So, for example, the operationally speaking, of the centralization and or realignment of Realty Authority should it receive approval. So there are folks with questions on this list. Okay, so we're hoping that this is just something smooth and easy that makes the world a better place, like the minister kind of outlined, but we'll just have to wait and see, I suppose. How did we get here? The Auditor General's 2017 report, the Real Estate Services chapter, was a scathing report on how this province and Infrastructure Ontario looks after or doesn't look after its properties, from contract management to maintenance. I was a couple times during estimates. I have asked many questions of Infrastructure Ontario, sat opposite the different folks in charge through the years, and generally speaking, the answer is always effectively, just trust us, we're looking after things. But the Auditor General's report laid out a bunch of specific recommendations after they had delved and done the work. None of those recommendations were to further privatize. They effectively said, get your house in order, or get your houses in order in this case. Haha. They're not houses, though. They're galleries and museums and whatnot. But it didn't say to privatize or to further privatize. I appreciate the member from Brampton North and his appreciation of puns. Thank you. Ontario Place contract with Therma. We've talked a lot about that. I'm not going to get into that too much, but that was a perfect example sitting across from Infrastructure Ontario where I asked them face-to-face about that contract, and I asked if there was a fairness monitor, and there was not. And we've raised that issue subsequently in the House, but there wasn't because it was, don't worry, we're fine, just trust us. Well, that is not a good track record for accountability or transparency. And so when Infrastructure Ontario is now holding the umbrella with all of these entities underneath it, the just trust us thing is not enough. Bill 69, again, this is passed, it has passed, and these are previous conversations, but a quick review, that bill is the Reducing Inefficiencies Act. And what was it for? Well, the government talked about office space all over the province and keeping track of it. So various entities that rented a floor and a half, and another one over here that rented a floor and a half. Oh my goodness, wasted space, let's combine. Fine. If there's an ability to reduce inefficiencies, okay, but what if that means taking that head office and moving it out of, like WSIB, for example, but taking that entity, moving it where it is no longer as accessible for people? That changes what we're accomplishing. If it's just a matter of making sure we're not having available floor space that we're not being thoughtful about, but if we're actually reducing Ontarians' ability to utilize these services and entities, that's different. This is why I will go back to encouraging the entities affected by these pieces of legislation to reach out and let us know how they're handling these changes. But we're not talking about office space in this bill, Speaker. We're talking about the McMichael and the Ontario Science Centre and the Royal Ontario Museum. Hardly office space. From the Auditor General's report, and if there's time later, I will get right into the weeds, and I know the government members are super excited and hoping that I get there towards the end of the hour. But just in case I don't, here is the overall conclusion from the real estate services part, from page 573 for the folks following along at home. Infrastructure Ontario could maintain government properties more cost-effectively by better overseeing the companies that it has engaged to provide most capital repair and property management services to ensure costs for capital repairs and property management services are reasonable and projects are completed on time. As well, existing government properties could be used more efficiently with people occupying less space per person. The agreement between Infrastructure Ontario and the Ministry of Infrastructure needs better performance standards to incentivize Infrastructure Ontario to manage and maintain government properties more cost-effectively. I'm going to add, I'm going to editorialize here because that's the quote. It would be great if the Ministry of Infrastructure actually worked on that agreement with Infrastructure Ontario, not just to incentivize IO to manage and maintain government properties more cost-effectively, but to actually maintain them at all. As we have stood in this House and talked about the Ontario Science Centre and the government's characterization of it and falling into disrepair and all that, guys, the landlord is Infrastructure Ontario. So if the money hasn't been spent and if the repairs haven't been done, you call the landlord and it's Infrastructure Ontario. So now we have a bill that says, well, let's give Infrastructure Ontario 11 more of our treasures to be in charge of. So you can understand how I feel. Okay. Anyway, moving on. I got a pile, though, so I'm trying to keep track. Speaker, Bill 151 takes a whole bunch of entities and real properties and puts them all into the pocket of Infrastructure Ontario. And as I've said, Infrastructure Ontario has some improving to do when it comes to being a landlord. The Science Centre example, under the authority of Infrastructure Ontario, they have been allowed to fall into, when I say a state of disrepair, more disrepair than they should be in. But folks at home, take your kids, go visit. Things are awesome there. Go and visit, enjoy. The public doesn't trust the government's decisions. So why should we? We would like this government to prove that they're not doing something harmful. And we haven't seen the business case for projects that are led by Infrastructure Ontario. So again, taking more entities, putting them under that IO umbrella. Really? Okay. I would like to ask if Infrastructure Ontario is indeed up to the job, because remember, this bill is called the Improving Real Estate Management Act, and now all these folks are under the IO umbrella. So we have privatization concerns. Infrastructure Ontario hands out mega contracts for a few large property management firms, and they're sending millions of public dollars to private pockets. So Infrastructure Ontario doesn't do the work themselves. You don't pick up the phone and say, hey, come fix this thing. Well, you do, but Infrastructure Ontario doesn't come and fix it. They send someone, hopefully. They spend the money and they manage those contracts, or they have property managers that are under them. Okay? So they're the middleman. There. Infrastructure Ontario is the middleman. In the 2017 AG report, they found that Infrastructure Ontario's repair and maintenance expenses are 20% higher than the private sector pays. Ontarians will pay more for repairs, and inevitably they get less. And this from the Auditor General. We would like to see that this work gets brought back in-house and restore the public sector capacity and affordability. Public dollars need to serve the public interest and not private pockets. And when we ask if Infrastructure Ontario is up to the job, again, one of the things I worry about is that we see another example of the potential to be helping rich friends. Again, right? There are fewer steps between the Premier's friends and the property they want to control. Right. So Infrastructure Ontario uses an uncompetitive process to select a small number of large private firms to manage its real estate assets. More about that later. In 2014, the Auditor General found that procurement was rigged to favour large providers like Colliers Project Managers, led by a past Conservative staffer, and there is limited competition for bids, meaning higher costs. Side note, many of us just met with the Ontario General Contractors Association. They're here today at Queen's Park. And they were talking about Infrastructure Ontario and the bidding process and the bundling, and that small or medium-sized companies who want to bid on local jobs, who want to be part of growth, who want to be part of building, they can't get in on that because 90% of the time it's one massive company, and they know that 10% chance for them to get that bid is not worth their time. Well, why is that, right? When the Auditor General was highlighting in detail a rigged process, the government should sit up and say, okay, yeah, we don't like that, right? Like, that's not fair for business. That's not fair for construction. We heard that in our meetings today. We heard about indemnification and that the government has made changes that now they would assume all of the risk for things that have gone wrong on a project, whereas there used to be a maximum. And that's a Treasury Board change, right? That's a government funding change. That's a you guys change. So there are lots of pieces here that aren't fitting, and I hope that you're listening. Something else I would say about Infrastructure Ontario and asking, are they up to the job? Trust is dwindling for this government and their connections. I've said this before, the public does not trust the government's decisions. I would love for them to prove that they're not doing something harmful with this. Because, as I said, and this isn't because I'm stupid, I have days, but I don't know the problem that this bill is trying to solve. Like, I don't. And I spend time in this world, so I don't get it. Walk me through it. Is Infrastructure Ontario up to the job? Listen, Infrastructure Ontario has been hollowed out with publicly accountable civil servants replaced by expensive private consultants and contractors. Infrastructure Ontario does not actually directly manage government real estate. Instead, it outsources property management to private contractors. The Auditor General report criticized Infrastructure Ontario's uncompetitive procurement and poor oversight of these private contracts. We don't know what problem it's trying to solve. I've said that before. It doesn't solve the problems revealed in the report. It might exacerbate them. The Auditor General report criticized the procurement for being uncompetitive. The fact that they were being awarded to contractors despite their poor past performance. The Auditor General also criticized Infrastructure Ontario's poor oversight of these contracts. So I'm kind of not glossing over this, but I'm just mentioning it. There are pages in that report. It makes for really great, interesting, late-night reading. To delve into just how broken things are. So how come we're not seeing those issues being addressed in a bill that's called Improving Real Estate Management? Speaker, in 2017, the Auditor General report focused on how poorly Infrastructure Ontario was managing the government's real estate portfolio. Literally what this bill is doing is giving more to Infrastructure Ontario to manage. Problems exist in the way Infrastructure Ontario is structured. The Auditor General found that the Enterprise Realty Service Agreement, or the agreement between the Ministry of Infrastructure and Infrastructure Ontario, did not set out mandatory minimum standards of performance for managing costs of capital projects. The agreement didn't set out standards, guys. The agreement did not set timelines for meeting the accommodation standard for office space, which is designed to ensure existing government properties are used efficiently. We talked a lot about that during Bill 69, about office space. But the recommendation that the government had about the agreement and setting timelines wasn't addressed. Also, the agreement did not set timelines for meeting the maintenance standard set out in that same agreement. Infrastructure Ontario is the province's landlord, and the Auditor General report focused on how poorly Infrastructure Ontario has been managing the government's real estate portfolio. Let's think about the Ontario Science Centre. When we don't keep costs reasonable, fewer resources are available to maintain aging assets, right? What did they say? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Well, $1 of preventative maintenance is worth a bucket load of money when you got to fix the thing after it's broken, okay? Thousands of public assets in urgent need of capital repairs, and we're overspending to deliver private sector profits. It costs more through Infrastructure Ontario than it would if we did it in-house, civil servants, okay? Deferred maintenance more than doubled from $420 million in March 2012 to $862 million in March 2017. And I'm using those numbers because that's what was in the report by the Auditor General. You'll recall that the Ontario Science Centre's landlord is none other than Infrastructure Ontario. You'll recall, because I keep telling you, I asked a question of the minister, and from her press release, or from my press release, I'm reading about myself in the third person, sorry, my press release.
I read it too.
So Ontario Science Centre economics don't add up. I won't read the whole press release, but after having asked the question, this is what we put out, and I'll share it with you in case you missed it. The minister says the Science Centre is falling apart, but their past business plans say nothing of the sort. To make matters worse, Ford's Conservatives have been depriving the Science Centre of the required maintenance for years. The Science Centre needs investment and repairs, not a half-baked plan with zero community consultation. Infrastructure Ontario is the Science Centre's landlord, and that's according to Ontario Science Centre's 2022-2023 business plan. And I don't know if it's that the government doesn't recognize that being a good landlord and doing the necessary repairs is far less costly than a new building. I don't think that the sudden interest in the Science Centre has anything to do with the Science Centre. No. With Infrastructure Ontario as the landlord, the minister and the ministry could have chosen to fund the needed repairs, but it has not. And this is not a new thing. This is an ongoing thing. When you look back at their plans and their reports through the years, you see that this has been a cumulative thing. But it's not falling down. That's not, like, it's a mischaracterization of what's really happening. The solution is funding and investment. It is not abandonment. And the Premier and the Minister of Infrastructure have been painting it and its architecturally significant building as a teardown, but it isn't. It isn't at all. And I hope that people go visit it. It will still be there in all of its magical glory, hopefully for another for the 250 years that Moriyama said that if with good investment it would stand. But I think the government has other plans. We'll see what happens. The Science Centre is a cherished provincial asset, even if the government is pretending otherwise. This government has claimed without evidence that at this point it would be more costly to complete long-delayed repairs of the Ontario Science Centre than to relocate it to Ontario Place with a much smaller facility, built atop a publicly funded, government-funded parking structure that alone will cost an estimated $500 million. The late Raymond Moriyama, the world-renowned architect of the Ontario Science Centre, has stated, as I've already mentioned, that with proper maintenance, the Ontario Science Centre could, quote, last beyond 250 years. Speaker, from an article here entitled Infrastructure Minister Offers Few Details on Business Case for Moving Ontario Science Centre. Ontario Infrastructure Minister declined to provide specific answers about the government's business case for moving the Science Centre to Ontario Place as part of the latter's controversial redevelopment. She said the decision to build a new and considerably smaller Science Centre on the waterfront will demolish the existing facility rather than repair it, was based on costs. So she was asked by the host or the interviewer, what was the cost to repair the building at the Ontario Science Centre? And the minister said the cost was higher. It was much more expensive. What was the cost specifically? She was asked, And the response was, while the government is doing its due diligence, we are verifying all of the numbers included in the business case. Before we share that information with the public, we want to triple check all of the information, end quote. Well, this was April.
Right.
I think by now they've had time to bajillion check all of the information, far beyond triple, but we still have no numbers. And spoiler alert, I don't think we're getting them.
No.
Anyway, I'll continue. It has already drawn criticism from some community groups, residents and mayoral candidates who, back in April, this is a while ago, who have questioned why the current science centre could not be upgraded and kept at its current location in North York. Environmental charity Swim, Drink, Fish says it can no longer stand behind the government's plan. Quote, the province of Ontario's plan for Ontario Place is simply too opaque and controversial for us to support, end quote. Construction on the new facility is slated to begin in 2025 with its opening expected in 2028. The existing science centre will remain open to the public until then, the province says, and then it will be demolished. It is the building is considered by many to be one of the finest remaining example of brutalist architecture in the city. This government's plan is fairly brutal, but not,
I would say.
not a fair comparison.
It's architecture.
Instead of treasuring a gem that would be a long-lasting asset in the province, they are planning to demolish it and diminish its future. Hear from what's that guy's name? Oh, Thunder Bay Atikokan. He always has something charming to add. Okay, moving on. This article is Confusion Reigns Over Doug Ford's Science Centre Plan that includes Conservation Authority land. The Toronto Region Conservation Authority says it doesn't understand why the Premier's plan includes housing on hazardous ravine land unfit for new development. So the Premier first said the Ontario Science Centre will be demolished and replaced with housing, but the Conservation Authority that owns much of the land is waiting to tell him that that's impossible. Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, they had said, quote, nothing can be built on our land there, but it's not just because of the TRCA, it's also city and provincial policies, which is why we were confused when the province announced affordable housing on that land. It's within a ravine and considered hazardous lands because of the steep slopes and the West Don River floodplain, so I'm not sure how you would accomplish building in that area. We and local community members are trying to get a better understanding of what the province's agenda is with that land. There have been announcements, but it's kind of unclear as to what the actual intention is. So the TRCA and the City of Toronto, so they own the area, they jointly leased it to the Science Centre for 99 years, ending in 2064, in an agreement that allows for only the centre on the site and requires renegotiation for any other uses, including housing, according to city officials who already have plans for new housing on adjacent city-owned parking lots. So, under fire for his Ontario Place redevelopment scheme that includes a towering private spa to be built by an Austrian company, the Premier on April 18th announced the Science Centre programming would move to the site and its, quote, tired concrete structure built into the ravine would be demolished. So the Premier told reporters the province is, quote, planning to get rid of the old Science Centre, putting in affordable, attainable, non-profit housing homes up there because that's what people need. But a week later, he changed course and said, quote, we're going to help you out with a new community centre and we're going to help you with a new school because they're in desperate need of a school, I hear, end quote. Well, you know what?
What do you need?
Guys, stop. Okay. What is true, I'm asking my own team to stop heckling me. I realize what happened there. Knock it off. Okay. Speaker, I will continue. All right. So the Premier doesn't seem clear on the purpose for the demolition. If it's going to be housing, then finds out it can't be, well, then it's going to be a community centre. It sounds like a science centre open to the public is a pretty awesome community centre and a community hub. But they've been painting it as a teardown, and it isn't. Mm-hmm. What is true is that capital repairs and building renewal are years behind. The minister says it's falling apart. It isn't. And the Science Centre, what they need is for people to come visit and enjoy it, and they need the government to cough up the needed funds and make the repairs. I don't remember who owns the property across the street from the Science Centre or in and around there, but is it one of the DeGasperas? The government can let me know. But there's lots of fingers in these pies. And even if I'm off and there's some other plan, we have no reason to trust this government. While we're talking about it, and I can because the government named the bill Improving Real Estate Management, and we're literally talking about managing their own real estate. In a piece by the Trillium, Jessica Smith-Cross has written, RFP for Diminished Science Centre at Ontario Place highlights space constraints. The province is moving forward with its plan to build a new provincial science centre in Ontario Place, issuing a request for proposals for planning and design. The province has confirmed the new building is expected to be about half of the size of the current building in Don Mills. Details about what that will mean for the programming can be found in the request for proposals, the RFP, which says Infrastructure Ontario has completed functional program, which is the description of the requirements of the facility, that was finished in 2022. The RFP then says 3 elements were initially in the functional program, which is a description of the requirements of the facility. So they said that 3 elements were initially in that, but had to be cut from it, quote, due to a required reduction in the size of the building / square footage, requiring rationalization of the current activities, end quote. So when Infrastructure Ontario had done its functional program, which is the description of the requirements of the facility, they had 3 things that were part of the requirements of the facility, and then they've had to be cut because of size, even though they're apparently integral. So those elements that have been cut are a large-scale immersive experience, an outdoor experience, and a planetarium. And Infrastructure Ontario will decide whether or not some or all of these pieces, if the work will be done. And they'll only include them if the cost is approved by Infrastructure Ontario. Well, that makes me sad because the outdoor experience it envisions, as it says here, is an adventure playground and iconic climbing, risky play structures throughout a large defined space, something interactive for the kids, right? Nope, no room. The Ontario Science Centre offers unique, interactive, large-scale, transformative, immersive experiences that the entire family can enjoy. The Telus Rainforest at the current site is one example of a large-scale immersive experience. This space in the Living Earth exhibit hall is dedicated to engaging visitors about biodiversity and unique characteristics of plants and animals living in a rainforest. The functional program does not currently contemplate the opportunity for a large immersive space that replicates the experiences of the Telus Rainforest. They're literally chopping down a rainforest. Oh my gosh. And there's no reason. It's so popular and it's awesome. But Infrastructure Ontario is like, there's no room. Because they're moving it for no reason. The other thing, of course, is unfortunately, currently there is no public major-sized planetarium in Toronto. And when we think about what a planetarium, offers, I'm not going to make comments about flat Earth versus the cosmos, but I think that a planetarium and the education that goes with that would be a missed opportunity to cut that. Anyway, it is sad that there is simply no way a science centre at Ontario Place could accommodate all of what the current centre does today, even though it's expected to be a 5 to 7 story building that would block views of Ontario Place iconic pods and Cinesphere. Ontario Place for All also accuses the province, I'm still reading from the article, Ontario Place for All also accuses the province of jumping the gun and pushing ahead with the plan before obtaining city approval. The new building is to be on city-owned land or approval from the Waterfront Toronto Design Review Panel, quote, or any form of community endorsement. It says, instead, Ontario Place for All wants to see the province bring additional Ontario Science Centre programming to the pods at Ontario Place, focusing on water science, while maintaining the original centre in Don Mills. That would be actually pretty cool if we have the science centre proper that people know and love, and then if they had a water edition, like a separate location, keep exploring. Anyway, Ontario Place for All, I think, was also in the news today, and while I don't have it in my pile here, I'm pretty sure that didn't they file an injunction today? So this conversation, fortunately, is not finished, and hopefully the Science Centre will also not be finished. Speaker, the Auditor General has recently announced investigations into both the government's plans for the Ontario Science Centre and for Ontario Place. Ontario Place and Therma and Ontario Science Centre mashup deal, all of that is of great interest to Ontarians, which is why on October 16th, the official opposition tried to bring forward a motion, and the government blocked the official opposition's Opposition Day motion to scrap the 99-year Therma deal. So we didn't even get to talk about it. And for months, we've been sounding the alarm on this government's absurd plan to put a luxury spa on Ontario Place and for their weird plan to move and demolish the Ontario Science Centre. Speaker, what we're talking about here today is a whole bill that is about bringing real estate management further into private hands, into the hands of the private contracted managers that Infrastructure Ontario allows to run things. That is actually the whole goal of this, is to bring it into Ministry and Infrastructure Ontario control, right? A perfect example of how there is zero accountability and no transparency when it comes to Infrastructure Ontario and the Ministry of Infrastructure. Like, that's entirely the point of this bill. The Premier of the Province of Ontario is currently under criminal investigation by the RCMP.
What?
Right? The mess of the Greenbelt grab is still unfolding. We have stood in this place and been forced to talk about massage table deals and boys' trips to Vegas and massive cash transactions and developer wish lists and personal sketchy dealings shaped by preferential relationships that are not in the best interest of Ontarians. Every deal this government has been doing falls under a cloud of suspicion. And maybe some of the deals they're doing are perfectly fine, but they keep tucking it where we can't see it. So how do we rest assured? For months, we've been sounding the alarm on this government's absurd plan to put the luxury spa on Ontario Place. And this Conservative infrastructure minister has been hiding important information on the Ontario Place project. As I said from that article, she said they were going to triple-check the numbers and then release it.
Yeah, 6 months later.
So far, she has failed to show us the business case for why the Ontario Science Centre needs to be moved to Ontario Place. I don't believe she has a business case. In her words, quote, Ontario Place has been sitting there, no one has been going there, I drive by it frequently and it's not enjoyed, quote, well, this is not correct, she knows it, because media reports have shown that she was told by the Ontario Place Corporation's chair that they had almost 3 million visitors last year. Wow. And the minister, tried to sell us on that nonsense that no one enjoys Ontario Place. We also learned that the Ministry of Infrastructure has not made public Ontario Place Corporation's annual report since 2018. 5 years, no reports. I would like to know why they're sitting on her desk. Our research yielded this from the Ontario Place Corporation, and the Ontario Place Corporation answered us with this, quote, our 2019 and 2020 annual reports are with the Ministry of Infrastructure, awaiting transmittal to the Office of the Legislative Assembly. Once they've been approved, Ontario Place Corporation will be posting these reports on its website. The Ontario Place Corporation 2021 annual report is tentatively scheduled for posting by February 28, 2024, with no date available for the 2022 annual report. Ontario Place Corporation's financial results are consolidated annually by the Government of Ontario, end quote. Fascinating. So they're turning in their numbers to the Ministry of Infrastructure. So 2019, that was a couple of years ago, yeah? 2019 and 2020 are sitting on a desk in the Ministry of Infrastructure. Yeah. I'd love to know what those numbers are, but also the annual report for 2021 is scheduled for posting by February 28, 2024, next year, with no date available for the 2022 annual report. So they've done their part, but now it's sitting on a desk, and we don't get to know it. It's supposed to be reported to the Legislative Assembly once it's passed forward to the Legislative Assembly by the minister. who ain't going to do it. They have provided their annual reports. Okay? The Ontario Place Corporation has provided their annual reports, and to recap, they're sitting on this minister's desk. That is hiding, and it's changing the rules mid-game, folks. During committee, when I asked Michael Lindsay, the CEO of Infrastructure Ontario, about whether or not there was a fairness monitor, which is standard for large procurements to ensure there is no funny business during the procurement process, he told us there was no fairness monitor. And a few days before the submission deadline for the Ontario Place project, the deadline was suddenly extended by 3 weeks. Infrastructure Ontario's own CEO confirmed to me at committee that while other bids had been received, Therma's bid had not been received before the deadline was extended. I asked to see what scoring criteria were used to evaluate the bids. Well, Infrastructure Ontario couldn't provide any. I asked to see the scorecards for each bid. Infrastructure Ontario couldn't provide them. Now, we see that the government's internal documents show the underground parking garage was being planned 2 years before the public knew about it. Stuff's exhausting. Despite the January 2021 document showing the parking garage, when these Conservatives unveiled their design concept 6 months later in July, they suspiciously did not include the parking structure in their renderings. But in their 2021 document, it showed the parking garage. The government told bidders on the Ontario Place redevelopment that they had to use whatever parking was already available and that the government would not fund any additional facilities. However, when Therma won the bid, suddenly they were offered a brand new publicly funded parking garage that was not offered to the other bidders. The other bidders were told they had to use what was available and there would be no parking. But for Therma, don't worry, we got you. This minister loves the line that the parking is for an unnamed mom with 3 kids who is going to park. We've heard that countless times. Here's the thing. This picture that she's desperately trying to paint for us about the mom with 3 kids leaves me with the question, is the parking garage for the public and not just for Therma customers? Because that's sort of the picture she's painting, that it's for everybody. However, as reported by Spacing, quote, the Ford government wants to bundle the proposed 5-story parking garage and the relocated science centre in a single public-private partnership deal that will see a for-profit consortium design, build, finance and maintain these 2 new Ontario Place facilities for 30 years. The project-specific scope attributes shared by the government details, quote, the below-grade parking structure is proposed to be integrated with the new OSC facility, providing up to 2,000 parking spaces in a 5-story underground structure to meet landlord lease obligations. End quote. Landlord lease obligations. So this is part of a landlord lease obligation, despite the fact that the original call for development clearly told bidders the government would not fund additional facilities. So the minister's mom with 3 kids gets to park only if she's taking her kids to the mega spa?
It sounds like it.
So I don't know what moms, maybe moms with 3 kids are interested in taking them all to the spa or leaving them at home and going to the spa. That's a real thing. I feel you on that. But you know what that mom with 3 kids needs? She needs a home she can afford. She needs her kids to be safe in funded schools. She needs her hospital to be funded so they can get the care they need. And she needs a government that isn't in cahoots with every fat cat with a thick wallet. That's what she needs. And Ontarians need a government they can believe and trust, and they don't have it. Since this government won't be honest or transparent about this deal, we wanted them to scrap. We still want you to scrap this deal, which is an insider deal, apparently, with Therma. Speaker, all of this is part and parcel of improving real estate management, which is the title of this bill. If they don't want to talk about improving real estate management, then they shouldn't name their bill this. But what I want to know is who is actually looking after Ontario's real estate portfolio. So I had already asked, is Infrastructure Ontario up to the job? I'm going to go with no. But who is actually looking after Ontario's real estate portfolio? Infrastructure Ontario hires a very small number of very large property management firms to manage its public assets. One of those companies is Collier's Project Leaders. So they used to be called MHPM, Collier's project leaders is led by past Conservative Party staffer Olivia McAngus.
Oh, yeah. Here we go.
Mega companies like Collier's project leaders are benefactors of massive government contracts. There are very few of them, right? There are very few very large property management firms. And that's been written about in 2017 in the Auditor General's report. And they talked about Company A and Company B. Okay, so in the report they weren't named, but since there are only two, it's not hard for us as Ontarians to know who we're talking about. So in a release that went out today, I asked a question this morning about Collier's project leaders. Last week, Infrastructure Ontario announced that they would continue to provide project management services for the province's real estate assets. She criticized the Infrastructure Ontario's previous procurement of project management services, and the new Collier's mega contract appears to be even bigger, folks. The permanent presence of embedded contractors within Infrastructure Ontario means that public dollars are going towards private profits instead of keeping Ontario's public buildings in a state of good repair. I want to know why the Premier is wasting money by maintaining a permanent presence of embedded private contractors within Infrastructure Ontario instead of bringing this core function back in-house to be delivered by civil servants who are accountable to the public and not to private shareholders. And I asked that question this morning, and I don't remember getting an answer that sort of answered that. But it's a real question, right? Especially if this is a government that talks about the dollars and cents of things. But, Speaker, I put out a statement today that the Ford government, like the Liberal government before it, is addicted to privatization and outsourcing. This latest mega contract will mean more public dollars flowing into private pockets. It means Ontarians will pay more for capital repair costs and inevitably get less. This private contractor has been embedded within Infrastructure Ontario for over a decade. And the Auditor General found that the previous procurement for this work in 2014 had been rigged to favour large contractors like Collier's, and Infrastructure Ontario only received 3 bids for 2 large contracts. While Infrastructure Ontario has not disclosed the value of the latest mega contract, it appears to be even bigger, and that limits competitive bids even further. Under the Liberal and PC government, supposedly public agencies like Infrastructure Ontario and Metrolinx have been hollowed out, with publicly accountable civil servants replaced by profit-seeking private consultants and contractors. The permanent presence of these embedded private contractors within the government means decisions about capital projects are being driven by private interests and not the public interest. Ooh, the room got quiet. I'm just looking for my page.
Brace yourselves.
So, yeah, I think the room is worried I stopped talking. They'd better start coming up with thoughtful questions to ask me. So, Speaker, I'm wondering if companies like Collier's are too big to be held accountable. And I worry about that because in our meetings today with the Ontario General Contractors Association, we did talk to construction companies who they can't even get in on the game, right? When the province has divided itself into 2 zones, and basically bundling, right, but 2 zones, it's a big province. What company is big enough to be able to handle part of, one of those 2 zones in terms of all property management? That's what we've got right now. And the Auditor General had said in her report that a lot of smaller local companies are putting their hands up and saying, could you carve out smaller areas? We would like to help manage. We would like to work in our communities and have jobs in our communities. We've got equipment to handle a small area, but when our company's in Thunder Bay and you want me to be responsible for Barrie and Oshawa, I can't do that. Right? So when we're going so big, it's not even elbowing out the competition. It's just a totally different game that smaller or growing companies can't get in on. And I think the government understands that. A lot of them come from the business world, right? And what we heard today from the General Contractors Association. There are a lot of things in the way that make it not fair and not competitive, and that's certainly what the Auditor General had highlighted. But focusing on Colliers, and this is the company that the government continues to award millions in real estate management contracts to. Like, that's literally who we're talking about. That's why I asked the question today. They've announced that they're embedded in Infrastructure Ontario. This is the company. In 2020, the federal government launched an investigation into business practices of Colliers project leaders in relation to their work on water treatment projects in Niskanaga First Nation. That's who we're dealing with, right? From this article in November of 2020, Indigenous Services Minister Mark Miller is preparing to launch a third-party investigation into the business practices of consultants and engineering companies hired to end Canada's longest-standing boil water advisory on a First Nation, a probe that could extend to other communities. So the federal minister is launching an investigation. Quote, the federal government's pledge comes after Chief Muniz, wrote to Miller on October 22nd demanding, quote, an immediate investigation into business practices of contractors, engineering companies hired to fix more than 2 decades of water problems that just got worse. Quote, we take the word of the engineers or consultants. Since we've been doing that, we've been under a boil water advisory for 25 years, end quote. Timmins James Bay NDP MP Charlie Angus called on Ottawa to probe the long-standing problems with Niskanaga Water Treatment Plant, along with other infrastructure projects in Northern Ontario First Nations. He said, quote, the problem is we have a system for delivering infrastructure that always goes with the lowest bidder. When you have a big-ticket item like a water plant that's very expensive to build in a community, costs and corners get cut, and that's the danger. Niskanaga has been a nightmare situation. End quote. Members of Niskanaga First Nation unleashed their frustration on Tuesday in front of the Office of Colliers Project Leaders, a project management company hired in 2016 by the community to upgrade its water treatment plant, shouting, fix our water. Muniz spoke to one of the engineers via Zoom. He said, quote, why did it have to come to this? I thought you were our help. I thought you were on our side. And the MP, Charlie Angus, said the system that is set up to award contracts to First Nations is flawed. In an email statement, a spokesperson for Colliers Project Leaders wrote, the company respects the right to legally protest and shares the desire to bring clean drinking water to the community. Chief Muniz has said he still can't understand why it's taking so long. He said, quote, I don't think it's because of where we are situated. I think it's because of the lack of will to finish this, end quote. So again, my question, are these companies that are handling more than half the province, or half the province, too big to be held accountable? Also in 2020, the previous CEO at Colliers Project Leaders pressured employees into giving up paid vacation days. Again, this is the company the government continues to award millions in real estate management contracts to. And the thing is, maybe they do good work on this, that, or the other thing, but when there's no competition, when the Auditor General says there aren't any standards for timelines, there aren't incentives in the agreement, then I would think that a responsible, kind of business-oriented government would sit up straight and say, whoa, that's not okay. That is not how we have a competitive process. That is not how we do business. We're going to fix that. And yet, so from this article, June of 2020, so a little while ago, right? But Colliers was in the news. CEO asks employees to lie on time cards or risk job losses, violating labour laws. Company apologizes, offers to return vacation days after go public inquiries. Several workers of a high-profile company say they were pressured into giving up paid vacation days, then told to lie about it on their time cards or risk job losses during the height of the pandemic. In an internal company video provided to Go Public, the president and CEO of Ottawa-based Colliers Project Leaders asks employees to surrender vacation time if they want to save their own jobs and those of their co-workers. Quote, I'm asking everyone to work a full week and to record an additional 8 hours of vacation into your timesheet every week in April and May, he said. Quote, this reduces our compensation costs and permits us to avoid mass layoffs. Now, if we all surrender a bit of future vacation, we can keep our coworkers and ourselves employed. End quote. One employee tells Go Public workers who refused to give up vacation days were pressured by managers to change their minds and their time cards, receiving frequent calls from higher-ups asking if they plan to comply. Quote, it's not a choice. There's so much fear that if you don't do this, you're going to lose your job, said the employee who works on infrastructure and revitalization projects for the company. The scary part is if you're going to get fired, say next week, you have no vacation time to show. End quote. According to two employment lawyers Go Public spoke with, it's against provincial labour laws to take away or reduce vacation time that's required by law and to produce false or misleading vacation time records. But labour lawyers say what Collier's project leaders was asking its employees to do was not only unethical but illegal. Quote, on every single level it's offensive, says lawyer Howard Levitt, who practices employment law in 8 provinces and is the editor-in-chief of the Dismissal and Employment Law Digest. Quote, encouraging workers to create fraudulent time cards is a violation of employment standards legislation in every single province across Canada, leaving employees with no official record of what the company owes them and no official guarantee they'll ever get their time or money, end quote, he says. Speaker, so again, this is the company the government continues to award millions in real estate management contracts to. And I hold in my hand Bill 151, Improving Real Estate Management Act 2023. There are opportunities to actually improve the management of properties and real estate and entities that we have here in Ontario. The Auditor General's report, I said earlier it was scathing, but I think it was fair. It was fair because it had all of these details and very real solutions laid out clearly. It criticized the procurement of the contracts for being uncompetitive and the fact they're being awarded to contractors despite poor past performance. But part of that is these areas of responsibility are so massive that a small or medium-sized company that we know and like in our community or could recommend cannot get in on that game. Mm-hmm. And I don't think anyone in this room thinks that that's fair, but that is what Infrastructure Ontario does, okay? And that is documented in the Auditor General's report. And there are opportunities for this government to kind of tighten those reins, to have input in that, and very clear suggestions that I don't even imagine you would disagree with in that Auditor General's report. 2017, but still fresh. Again, back to this bill, we don't really know what the intentions are. I don't know whether to imagine that they are benign or that they're nefarious. This bill, there's not too much in it, but it's the implications, right? It's the bringing it under the control of Infrastructure Ontario, who is the middleman that is responsible for responsible for, kind of, I guess. Anyway, they organize who looks after the maintenance. They're the landlord, but they hire a contractor to come and do this, and very few folks are able to get in on this. Whether we're talking about maintenance, which we have been today, or we're talking about actually capital repairs or building. One of the recommendations that the Auditor General made, the first recommendation, is we recommend that Infrastructure Ontario review and adjust accordingly its process for procuring project management services, to formally prepare a new business case on whether to enable more project management companies in the future to bid on such services, to include standard penalties for all contract managers on future RFPs, and incorporate past performance in the evaluation of the bidders. Those are pretty basic things that I think are head nodders. But then in reality, as I had said, is Colliers and others like them, or the other one like them, are they too big to be held accountable? Because that was a big part of the Auditor General's report is, yeah, they haven't met the standards, yeah, they missed the deadline, yes, poor performance, yes, there are concerns and challenges, but there's nobody else. Well, part of that is because the map chunk is so big that no other company can say, yes, I can look after that. And that's an Infrastructure Ontario decision. Like, that's them. So you guys should pick up the phone and say, is that Jennifer French girl talking about something that makes sense? Yeah, I am. And so is the Auditor General. And the member from Brampton North, I see him enthusiastically participating. I'm going to read that as support of what I've said. He may disagree. I'll give him the chance to get up and ask me. But I really do appreciate his participation. Speaker, I'm essentially out of time after an hour, but I will say that we don't know what problem this bill is meant to solve. No. It certainly does not solve the problems revealed in the Auditor General's report. It might make them worse. In short, the bill does nothing to address the actual problems, and we... Thank you.
It's now time for questions. I recognize the member for Brampton West.
Thank you so much, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the member for the speech. Madam Speaker, the Reducing Inefficiencies Act is about ensuring that we're saving taxpayer dollars, also cutting red tape and practicing good governance while remaining fiscally prudent. Legislation related to Bill 8 allows the government to ensure that we are overseeing and optimizing the management of Ontario's large and complex realty portfolio. And it is our government's obligation to the people to be fiscally responsible when managing government assets. So my question to the member opposite is, why does the NDP favor the mismanagement of taxpayer dollars?
Back to the member from Oshawa for response.
That's so interesting. Okay, so on page 586 of the 2017 Auditor General's report in the Real Estate Services section, they outline that Infrastructure Ontario issued a request for proposals for management services for capital projects for government properties worth $900 million over 5 years. They split that into, let's see. The RFP stated that one project management company would be assigned to each zone, which limited the builders to larger real estate project management companies that had sufficient resource to cover the required volume of projects. The result was that the competition attracted only 3 companies to bid 2 contracts for an estimated 7,500 projects, each worth between $100,000 and $10 million, were awarded to 2 of the 3 companies that had bid. We are giving them so much money, and they are costing so much more than it would if civil servants did the job and if we brought it in-house. That is so documented. How on earth can you financially justify that just like handing money out the door to them and without accountability is good business?
Question. I recognize the member for London Fanshawe.
Thank you, Speaker. And I want to congratulate the member from Oshawa on her 1-hour lead on Bill 151. She talked a lot about government trust and public trust, and the government's record on building housing is kind of sketchy at best with the scandal under the Greenbelt. A lot of public trust was broken. Under the Ontario Science Centre, you had talked about how this government isn't releasing the business case that happened in the spring, but there is the late Raymond Moriyama, the world-renowned architect of the Science Centre, has stated that with proper maintenance, the Ontario Science Centre could actually last for beyond 250 years. Again, how does this instill trust when the government is not releasing the business case, flip-flops on housing and then the community centre? Where is the trust when it comes to the time?
Response, back to the member from Oshawa.
I don't have trust, and I don't know how the average Ontarian does. I mean, I'm in this space a lot, so we get to be in the weeds. But the folks out there know that the Science Centre is not falling down around their ears, that it's, it is a community treasure. And when they find out that the landlord is Infrastructure Ontario and the middleman who has not put the money in, that the repairs have not been done, that's on Infrastructure Ontario. That's on this minister. So it doesn't make any sense that the government continues along these paths. The minister absolutely could show the numbers. She said in that article I read that they're triple checking, but that was April. Come out with the numbers.
Response.
Be accountable with numbers. This isn't new.
Questions? I recognize the member for Brampton North.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague from Oshawa for the hour of remarks. I listen, and I don't always agree with the politics of the member. Certainly appreciate the attention paid to the file, and I listen intently. One of the parts of the member's speech that I was a little leery of was when the member talked about being leery of words like modernization and optimization. And I'm not old, but I'm old enough to remember when the NDP used to be a party that championed progress and modern values. And I've even seen the NDP modernizing. They used to just oppose building hospitals just because it was our idea. They actually supported us on scrapping the carbon tax recently, which I think is modernization of their approach. I'm wondering if the member will be recommending that the caucus continues to modernize their approach by supporting good common sense PC solutions like the ones put forward in this bill.
Back to the member from Oshawa for response.
So the member from Brampton North, I miss his engagement on the committee that he and I both sat on, and I would invite him and the government House Leader to put him back on, because we were doing really good work on that committee for Procedure and House Affairs. You too, talking about the restoration of this building, the restoration, the revitalization, but the important work and the cost, the attention, all the things involved in keeping this building a special part and heart of Ontario. So modernizing, there you go, but maintaining and keeping the soul of this space. And yet the Minister of Infrastructure is like, oh, the Science Centre is 50 years old, tear it down.
Response.
And we can't have that kind of thing. So I miss the member. I come back to committee. We've got work to do about really taking care of Ontario's spaces. Come on.
Question. I recognize the member for Scarborough Southwest.
Thank you very much, Speaker. I also want to thank the member from Oshawa for her 1 hour lead on Bill 151, and she spoke a lot about the different reasons why we would question this bill and what is the purpose behind it. Because when you have Infrastructure Ontario and the way they have handled, and really the lack of repair, lack of maintenance we've seen with what they have already been given that task to do. Why is the government sort of adding, to their plate? Because to me, it seems like they're just adding a layer of private profit and to this middleman, and the service costs, which will all go back to the taxpayers. So I just want to hear the member's thoughts, because I know she went on to speak a little bit about private profit and what we are seeing with the result of
back to the member from Oshawa for response.
Yeah, there was so much in that. I'm not sure really which part to answer, but I'm going to tell some from my notes I didn't actually get to share, because if we're giving more to Infrastructure Ontario, I have concerns. Some of the Auditor General concerns that she flagged, Infrastructure Ontario doesn't obtain enough information from their external project managers to assess whether they're doing a good job. They don't track how many vendors bid on capital projects or which vendors are successful. Their preliminary estimates don't factor in additional costs incurred to address actual site conditions, right? We have no idea about the cost-benefit value. Capital projects completed between April and March 2017, well, April 2013, March 2017, were completed on average 330 days later than originally scheduled. Like, there's no accountability. Everything she flagged was problems with numbers, and yet this government says, 11 more entities. Here, get under the umbrella.
Question. I recognize the Solicitor General.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to thank the member opposite. You know, when we heard the debate improving the Real Estate Management Act, for me, it is about understanding best practices. It's understanding that we're living in 2023 and not a long time ago. It's understanding that we're one of the largest landowners and landlords of properties in Ontario. And it's understanding that we need to be modern how we look at things. So I'd like to ask the member opposite, given that the times we're in, given that the technology is so much different today, why can they not accept that best practices, including moving forward with this bill?
Back to the member from Oshawa.
Yeah, so the technology piece doesn't make any sense with this bill. This is about 5 of the entities not being allowed to buy or sell like freehold real estate without the permission of the minister. This is about the other, 6 being brought completely under the control, like the real estate assets completely under the control of Infrastructure Ontario. This is not about modernizing technology or what have you. This is about control. What the government will do with that control and that information has yet to be determined, which is why I've asked, what is the problem that this bill is setting out to achieve? Because if the minister is going to make a reference to technology or whatnot, how does that connect? I hope one of the government members gets up and tells a story to us about what the heck this is for, because rather than being about real estate improvement or management and improvement, it seems to be about, I have no idea why you're just consolidating. So enlighten us, please, and thank you.